Why are you even touching that interface? The voice sliced through the sterile air like a scalpel, sharp, cold, laced with contempt. A tall white man in a charcoal suit towered over her, eyes narrowing as if he had just caught a child reaching for something forbidden. She froze. Her hand was still resting gently on the sleek AI control panel, fingertips hovering near a cluster of glowing blue indicators. She hadn't even pressed anything. Not yet. He didn't wait. He lunged forward, slapped her wrist away with a flat palm. Her elbow bumped a mop bucket. Water sloshed violently over the rim, cascading across the pristine marble floor. A digital clipboard clattered down beside her, its glass screen spidering into sharp, useless fractures. You people? He muttered with a shake of his head, stepping back with dramatic disgust. Should stick to cleaning up after the real engineers. What he didn't know was, this woman wasn't just a janitor. She was the daughter of the man who built this company. And soon, she'd be the one signing his termination papers. At exactly 5:48 a.m., the freight elevator opened to reveal a woman in a navy blue maintenance jumpsuit. She stepped out quietly, gripping a supply caddy in one hand and a mop in the other. Her ID badge read, Danielle Reed and ViroShine Contract Services. But that wasn't her name, and this wasn't just another morning shift. She was Dr. Asha Trenton, former MIT robotics prodigy, published author on neural ethical modeling, and, if everything went according to plan, the soon-to-be CEO of Neuraloom Technologies. Only two people in the entire company knew her real identity: her father, Howard Trenton, and his trusted legal advisor. Neuraloom was born 25 years ago, in the dusty garage behind their childhood home in West Seattle. Her father built the first prototype, an adaptive scheduling AI for hospitals, on a second-hand Dell he'd refurbished himself. Back then, it wasn't about billion-dollar valuations or patent wars. It was about helping real people make better decisions with clearer data. But the years had hardened the world. Investors demanded scale. Executives hired for efficiency, not empathy. Somewhere along the way, the mission blurred. The code that once empowered began to predict, sort, exclude. The AI began reflecting human bias, only faster, slicker, hidden in millions of lines of math. By the time Howard's Parkinson's advanced past the point of steady leadership, Neuraloom was unrecognizable. So, on the final night of Q2, during a quiet walk on the rooftop garden of their office tower, father and daughter had a conversation that would change everything. You have the brains, he said softly, his voice shaky but firm, and the heart, but you've never seen the company through the eyes of the people who hold it up. She looked away, unsure what to say. You've been on panels, boards, all the top floors, but not where the code gets cleaned up, not where errors hurt. Down there. He tapped the railing, pointing toward the employee access level. Down there, real things break. So what do you want me to do? She whispered. Disappear, he replied. 2 weeks, no last name, no PhD, no privileges, just a uniform, a mop, and a different name. And she agreed. Her transformation was surgical. The legal team created a full alias. Danielle Reed, 35, hired through a third-party facilities contractor. No access to executive floors. No biometric shortcuts. Her sleek black curls were tied into a tight low bun under a cap. She wore no makeup, no jewelry. Her gait slowed, posture softened. Even her voice, normally confident and precise, was tempered into something quiet, almost hesitant. For 14 days, she would work rotating shifts cleaning floors, restocking sanitation bots, and quietly observing the company she was destined to lead. No one recognized her. Not the interns, not the senior data scientists, not even the CTO who had once mentored her through a machine learning fellowship 5 years ago. But she noticed everything. The microaggressions, the hallway gatekeeping, the AI recommendation systems that always flagged resumes from historically black colleges for manual review. She noticed the engineers who rolled their eyes at night shift workers. She noticed the cafeteria algorithm that gave priority seatings to upper-level staff IDs. And above all, she noticed the rot not in the code but in the culture. It was on day 5 that the incident happened, when she paused by the AI interface to examine a query running a racial bias audit. She wasn't touching anything, just observing. And that's when the man in the charcoal suit, Philip Carson, Senior Director of Predictive Systems, decided she'd overstepped. What he didn't know was that his own department's budget would soon be under her review, and this time she wouldn't be silent. Her story didn't begin in a boardroom or a startup incubator. It began in the back seat of a 1998 Toyota Corolla, wedged between stacks of her father's circuit schematics and half-eaten lunch containers. While other kids spent their Saturdays in dance class or Little League, Asha spent hers listening to the gentle hum of soldering irons and the tap-tap of a tired man coding by lamplight. Howard Trenton didn't have wealth. He didn't have connections. What he had was an obsession with systems, with balance, with the idea that intelligence could be taught, not just born. He worked 2 jobs, teaching night classes at a community college and doing freelance network repair, to fund his real dream: building machine learning models that could help small clinics optimize patient flow without drowning in administrative noise. By the time Asha turned 9, she could navigate a Unix shell faster than most undergrads. Her bedtime stories weren't fairy tales but conversations about Gödel's incompleteness theorem, the beauty of recursion, and what it meant when a machine made a choice, not because he wanted to turn her into a prodigy, but because she was the only one who listened without judging him. She didn't always understand everything he said, but she understood the way his eyes lit up when he spoke about justice. Not courtroom justice, systemic justice, the kind of fairness that didn't depend on your zip code or skin color. Those early years were marked by scarcity. Rents overdue, groceries bought with coins, library books returned late because gas money was needed for job interviews. But Asha never saw her father break. Not when the bank denied him a loan for his first prototype. Not when his co-founder stole their research and spun it into a startup that made the Forbes list while Howard stayed up rewiring routers in exchange for grocery cards. She watched. She absorbed. And somewhere in that quiet storm, a seed took root. Asha's brilliance bloomed early, but it wasn't loud. She was the girl who corrected her algebra teacher's logic proof politely, the one who submitted her science fair project on predictive epidemiology when everyone else was testing the pH of soda. By 15, she had earned a scholarship to attend a pre-college summer program at Stanford, but when she arrived, something changed. For the first time, she wasn't the smartest person in the room, and she wasn't the only black girl either. There were 2 others, and like her, they'd grown up fighting for space in rooms they were never invited into. They shared dorm meals, traded late-night ideas, and built a mini recommendation engine for neighborhood recycling patterns using Python and a busted Raspberry Pi. They didn't win the top prize, but they won something else: clarity. That summer taught Asha the value of being underestimated, and how to weaponize it. College came next on a full ride to MIT, not just because of her test scores, but because she wrote a personal essay about watching her father be turned down again and again, not for lack of skill but because he didn't look like someone who should be leading a tech company. She majored in electrical engineering and computer science, with a focus on human-computer interaction. She didn't care about building the next Facebook or designing a new streaming algorithm. What drove her was impact. Could AI triage mental health crises more effectively than hotline queues? Could predictive analytics stop housing discrimination in real estate platforms? Her professors called her idealistic. Some said it like a compliment. Others didn't. She graduated top of her class, but even with accolades, publishing credits, and an internship at a leading robotics lab, job offers didn't pour in the way they did for her white male peers. In one particularly humiliating interview, a senior recruiter told her flatly, "Your resume's impressive, but honestly, we've never had someone like you on the data modeling team. You might find culture fit challenging." She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She simply thanked him and walked out, then spent the next 6 months building something of her own, a prototype AI system called Equivox. It wasn't flashy. It didn't promise to revolutionize e-commerce or disrupt ride-sharing. It did one thing. It measured institutional bias in hiring pipelines using anonymized data signals. The first pitch meeting was a disaster. Investors nodded, smiled, asked if she had a white male co-founder. One even said, "This is a little social justice Y for our portfolio." But she didn't quit. Instead, she entered Equivox into a Tech for Good competition hosted by a nonprofit incubator. Out of 147 entries, her team, 3 women of color, self-funded with borrowed gear, placed first. The win didn't come with much cash, but it came with something more valuable: visibility. That's when Howard called her. It was the same day he was diagnosed. "I'm tired, Asha," he told her over the phone, his voice trembling. "And this company, it's growing faster than I can hold. But I built it for people like you. People who see what's missing. I need to know it'll be in the right hands." She didn't hesitate. She booked a flight that night. When she returned to Neuraloom, the hallway light sensors didn't recognize her anymore. Not because they'd been reprogrammed, but because she had. She wasn't a girl building systems in her bedroom anymore. She wasn't the intern shadowing engineers who mocked her accent. She was the woman who would soon rewrite the DNA of an entire corporation. And this time she wasn't asking for permission. The first thing Asha noticed when she returned to Neuraloom wasn't the technology. It was the silence. A strange kind of tension hummed through the air, like static clinging to the walls. Conversations cut off when certain people walked by. Side glances lingered longer than necessary. Even the ambient AI voice that used to greet employees by name had been reprogrammed to default to user ID, unless explicitly trained. It wasn't malice. It was detachment. The company her father built to connect had started to forget the very people it was meant to serve. That realization haunted her more than the failing quarterly numbers, more than the lukewarm investor calls, more than the urgent push for a product pivot whispered in every closed-door meeting. Neuraloom had grown powerful, but it had stopped being human. And so, she returned to Equivox, the AI framework she had built from scratch, the one that corporate funders once dismissed as too radical. This time she wouldn't pitch it. She would embed it, quietly, systematically, one protocol at a time. She started small. She tasked a back-end team to run Equivox through the internal HR database, under the guise of bias auditing compliance. The results weren't just damning, they were undeniable. Resume shortlists were disproportionately flagging candidates with Anglo-American names. Review scores from mid-level managers showed consistent downward deviation for non-white applicants in performance categories tied to communication tone and cultural fit. Even the AI-generated onboarding plans were recommending fewer growth tracks for women of color. It wasn't malicious code. It was inherited pattern. Data trained on decades of inequality had simply learned to repeat it. Most execs froze when she presented the findings at her first closed session as acting CTO. But she didn't. "This is not a glitch," she said firmly, tapping the smartboard. "This is a mirror, and we built it." She knew integrating Equivox into the core Neuraloom platform would face resistance. Too many had built careers on the status quo. Too many investors feared the word accountability more than any market loss. But she also knew the one language the industry couldn't ignore: proof of concept. So, she picked a pilot city, Detroit, a place where data had failed people for decades. Partnering with the city's Department of Housing, she proposed a bold initiative: use Equivox to analyze housing assistance algorithms, root out bias in case prioritization, and reroute support to underserved applicants based on need, not legacy systems. Within 3 months, response times improved by 27%. Case approval equity, measuring racial and income balance, jumped by 42%. One local administrator called it The first time our tech actually felt like it saw us. The media caught on fast. Black-led AI program reverses decades of urban data bias. From MIT to Motor City. How one woman is rebuilding tech's moral compass. Suddenly, the calls Asha received weren't from hesitant investors. They were from community leaders, school districts, nonprofit hospitals, each one asking the same thing. Can we use this, too? And for the first time in years, Neuraloom wasn't just growing again. It was healing. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. At a quarterly strategy retreat in Napa Valley, one board member leaned in and asked in a half-joking tone, "Is this all going to become some kind of social justice software firm now?" She didn't smile. She simply said, "If justice is a byproduct of accurate data, I'm good with that." She watched his face tighten and made a mental note. Funding was the next wall. Her expansion roadmap required capital, real capital, but venture firms still balked. AI for social good wasn't a sexy vertical. It didn't promise billion-dollar exits or infinite ad tracking potential. So, she turned to someone who understood quiet power. Alma Jennings, a former advisor to her father, now a partner at an impact-first capital firm on the East Coast. Alma listened. She didn't interrupt, didn't ask about ROI first. She only asked one question. Are you willing to lose the ones who never believed in this to begin with? Asha didn't flinch. I already have. Within weeks, Alma's firm led a Series B round, bringing in $64 million, not from hedge funds, but from mission-aligned endowments, civic tech alliances, and a syndicate of angel investors from historically black colleges. The money didn't just sustain growth, it redefined it. Asha launched 3 new divisions. Loombridge, focused on retraining formerly incarcerated individuals to operate and test AI bias detection software. Neurokind, AI wellness companions developed in partnership with Black and Indigenous mental health providers. Trenton Works, an internal equity audit platform offered to mid-size companies with no in-house ethics team. Within 18 months, Neuraloom wasn't just a tech firm. It was a movement, and at its center stood a woman once mistaken for a janitor, now delivering keynote addresses at global AI summits and testifying before Senate panels on algorithmic fairness. But she never forgot what powered it all. Not the code, not the funding, not the buzzwords. What powered it was perspective. Earned in quiet corridors, learned through rejection, sharpened in the silence of being overlooked. She didn't want to be the face of a company. She wanted to be its compass. And now the world was watching where she pointed next. They called it the model that listens, not because it had the highest precision or the lowest latency, or because it won awards at global tech expos, though it did. They called it that because, for the first time, people in forgotten corners of cities began to feel like someone, somewhere, finally understood their story. And that story was being seen not as noise in the data, but as the data itself. Equivox had begun as a tool to detect bias, but under Asha's direction, it evolved into something far greater. A bridge. One of the earliest large-scale deployments happened in New Orleans, partnering with the city's public education department. The mission was simple. Use AI to identify why students of color were disproportionately marked as at risk by predictive dropout models. What Equivox uncovered shook the system. The labels weren't based on grades or behavior. They were tied to zip codes, parent occupation status, and even lateness logs that failed to account for neighborhoods with limited bus routes. In one instance, a 13-year-old named Mason had been flagged for chronic disengagement, but the model, after calibration with Equivox, revealed a different story. Mason lived with his grandmother, worked part-time to help with rent, and had never missed a homework assignment. He wasn't disengaged, he was exhausted. When the AI flagged his case for human reevaluation, the school intervened. Mason was given a flexible schedule and a mentorship grant. He graduated 2 years later, top 10% of his class. His thank you letter to Neuraloom hangs in the company's Seattle headquarters to this day. It's signed in blue marker, next to a doodle of a robot holding a diploma. But Asha knew that education was only one front. Access to fair housing, equitable healthcare, small business funding, even parole board reviews. All of them were being shaped by AI systems. And most of those systems were designed by people who had never stepped foot into the communities they were judging. So she launched the Aurora Project, a NeuroLoom initiative focused on deploying AI into underserved neighborhoods first, flipping the traditional rollout model on its head. In Cleveland, Aurora helped the community health center redesign its appointment system. The old model penalized missed visits without understanding why patients missed them. The new AI considered variables like bus route inconsistencies, caregiving responsibilities, and language barriers. No-show rates dropped by 39%. Patient satisfaction rose by 60%. In Oakland, the project helped rewire a microloan platform that had unknowingly favored applicants with Anglo-European surnames and higher broadband speeds. An invisible proxy for wealth. After Equivox integration, the platform's approval diversity increased threefold. More importantly, the repayment rate improved, proving that inclusive design wasn't just moral, it was profitable. But the most personal deployment came in Jackson, Mississippi. Asha's mother had grown up there. Dirt roads, two-room schoolhouse. She used to say, "Out here, technology always arrives last and leaves first." So when a local nonprofit contacted NeuroLoom about building a digital access hub, Asha didn't send a manager. She went herself. She stood in the same fields her mother once picked tomatoes in. She listened to the community elders. She ate at the local diner where people still paid in cash and left exact change. And then, she met a girl named Shanice. Shanice was 16, bright, fierce, obsessed with biology, but she had never used a laptop that wasn't cracked. Her school had no Wi-Fi. Her teachers printed AI articles from 3 years ago and taught them from binders. When Asha asked her what she wanted to be, Shanice didn't hesitate. "I want to design a neural net that can read cells faster than a microscope." Asha smiled, and within 6 weeks, NeuroLoom shipped over $50,000 worth of refurbished devices, hired 3 remote instructors from Camden Tech, and launched a pilot AI literacy program. Shanice became the first student in Jackson's district to place in the National Youth AI Challenge. Her mother cried on the phone with Asha after the ceremony. She said, "People down here thought this tech wasn't for us, but you showed her it could be hers." Still, Asha didn't pretend AI was a silver bullet. She was the first to admit its dangers. Surveillance creep, predictive policing, digital redlining. So she didn't just build tools, she built safeguards. Every NeuroLoom model came with transparency protocols, plain language explanations, opt-out systems, and community oversight boards. She founded the Lighthouse Council, an independent ethics review panel composed not just of data scientists, but teachers, single parents, faith leaders, formerly incarcerated men, and frontline nurses. When a NeuroLoom model was flagged for disproportionately downgrading small business applications from women over 50, the council blocked its deployment. Asha approved the recall without protest. Her statement read, "If our models ever silence the people they were meant to serve, then they are no longer ours to release." Inside the company, change wasn't just external, it was cultural. She mandated equity reviews for every new hire panel. Leadership bonuses became partially tied to inclusion metrics. Language used in internal AI model documentation was revised to eliminate legacy terms like master/slave and whitelist. She didn't cancel. She educated. She didn't shame. She trained. And slowly the company changed shape, not by force but by belief. NeuroLoom's workforce grew more diverse, not just in color, but in discipline, geography, and thought. For the first time, field engineers were given sabbaticals to teach workshops in their hometowns. Coders from refugee backgrounds were invited to co-author white papers. The message was simple. You belong here, not despite where you're from, but because of it. And every step of the way, Asha remained visible. Not as a celebrity, not as a poster child for black excellence, but as a woman walking hallways, answering emails at 2 a.m., listening more than she spoke. She once told her team, "If we build AI that only replicates what's worked for the few, we've failed the many. But if we build it from the margins outward, then maybe, just maybe, we've started a revolution." It was never about building the fastest AI, not for Asha, not for her team, not for the communities that had finally begun to see their reflection in the code. It was about doing it right. That's why, after the Aurora project scaled nationally, and media outlets began calling her the ethical architect of AI, Asha didn't take a victory lap. She called a meeting, not with investors, not with PR, but with the ethics division. "Every time we grow," she said, "we're one decision away from forgetting who we are." They listened, because they knew at Neuraloom, ethics wasn't a footnote. It was the operating system. She began by instituting a new AI review process called Reflect, Relevance. Does this solve a real problem, not just a market gap? Equity? Who benefits first? Who benefits least? Feedback. Have the end users been heard before deployment? Logic. Is the model explainable even to non-engineers? Environment. Are we considering sustainability in our training cycles? Consent. Is there true informed opt-in at every level? Truth. What biases are baked into our datasets and who's watching for them? It was slow. It was expensive. Some clients pushed back, but she didn't waver. "We're not chasing disruption," she said once on stage at an MIT symposium. "We're chasing trust, and that doesn't scale overnight." Internally, she knew leadership wasn't just about being visible. It was about being accountable. So she built a team that didn't look like every other C-suite in Silicon Valley. Her chief data officer was a blind software engineer from Bogota. Her VP of strategy was a former librarian who specialized in community archiving. Her general counsel was a black trans woman who'd written landmark policy on digital discrimination. None of them had traditional resumes. All of them had lived the problems they were now solving. Mentorship became a priority, not just as a diversity checkbox, but as a leadership pipeline. Every executive was assigned 2 men's from underrepresented backgrounds. These weren't coffee chats. These were paid development plans with goals, feedback loops, and rotation opportunities. They didn't just teach skills. They taught voice. And voice mattered, because Neuraloom was now building tools for the most delicate spaces: juvenile justice, hospice care, tribal education systems. Places where silence had once meant survival. Now Asha wanted it to mean choice. So she greenlit Project Echo, an initiative to embed narrative context into AI decisions. When an algorithm denied a loan, it didn't just say insufficient data. It told the story. "You were flagged due to inconsistent employment, but our new model recognizes freelance gaps. Here are your options." When a child's learning model suggested alternate pacing, it didn't label them a low grade. It said, "Your learning rhythm is unique. Let's build around it." People weren't treated as data points anymore. They were narratives in progress. Still, Asha understood the weight of visibility. She was now the face on magazine covers, the keynote at international summits, the interview that journalists framed with, "First black woman too," headlines she'd grown tired of correcting. But the visibility wasn't just for her. It was for them. For every girl with a dream too complex for their school to understand. For every mother coding at midnight. For every teen told they should lower their sights. She never sugar-coated her journey. She spoke about imposter syndrome in boardrooms, about the nights she questioned if changing the system from within was even possible. And in those moments of vulnerability, people listened harder. One afternoon, during a mentorship roundtable, a young intern nervously asked, "How do you lead when you're still healing from the places that told you you'd never belong?" Asha paused, then smiled gently. "You remember," she said, "that those wounds are where the light leaks in. and that light becomes your compass. You lead not because you've forgotten the pain, but because you haven't. Her father, now retired, still visited the Neuraloom campus every Friday. He didn't ask about revenue charts or market share. He asked about impact. He once told her, after watching a user testing video, "You've done it, Asha. You've made intelligence kind." That night, she cried in her office for the first time in months. By 2025's end, Neuraloom had expanded into 11 countries, partnered with 23 community coalitions, and influenced 3 pieces of federal legislation on algorithmic fairness. But for Asha, the real milestones weren't legislative. They were moments like these: a formerly incarcerated mother in Atlanta, using a Neuraloom-powered app to finish her GED, a group of indigenous students in British Columbia learning how to train their own AI voice assistants in their ancestral language, a refugee youth center in Berlin building a bias-resistant resume screener from scratch. These weren't press releases. They were proof that leading with purpose didn't dilute innovation. It deepened it. And as the world braced for another wave of AI revolutions, synthetic media, autonomous governance, predictive policy models, Asha stood firm in the same truth she'd always carried. Technology should not just anticipate our needs. It should reflect our values. And those values of justice, clarity, compassion were not incompatible with code. They were its most powerful language. Not every story ends with a standing ovation, but this one did. The day Asha stood before a crowd of thousands at the Global Ethics in Tech Summit, the hall was quiet. Not because they weren't impressed, but because something rare had happened. They believed her. Not just in her success, not just in her company, but in the simple, revolutionary idea that technology, when guided by empathy and justice, could actually heal what it once harmed. She didn't use flashy slides. She didn't boast quarterly wins. She told the story of a janitor who once stood beside a glowing AI interface and was told to step back. She told them what happened when that janitor stepped forward instead. Unrecognized, unwelcomed, unafraid. And then she paused. She looked across the sea of faces. Engineers, policymakers, students, skeptics, and said, "Don't wait for permission to make this world more fair. We have the tools now. We just need the will." And they stood, not because she asked them to, because deep down they knew she was right. Her journey, like so many others, wasn't just about breaking into the room. It was about redesigning the room entirely. You don't need to be a CEO to do that. You don't need a PhD or venture capital or a platform with millions of followers. What you need is conviction. What you need is a reason to stay in the conversation, even when it hurts. What you need is the courage to ask not "what can AI do?" but "what should it do?" Because the future of artificial intelligence doesn't belong to coders alone. It belongs to teachers, asking why learning algorithms penalize kids with speech delays. It belongs to nurses, flagging how diagnostic tools misread darker skin tones. It belongs to activists demanding transparency in policing software. It belongs to grandparents, wondering why their search results make them feel invisible. It belongs to you, whoever you are, wherever you are, if you dare to step closer. So what can you do? Start small. Small Blue Diamond, learn the language. You don't have to become a developer overnight. But knowing what an algorithm is, what data training means, how machine bias works, that's power. Try platforms like AI for Anyone, DataKind, or Black in AI, built to make AI literacy accessible. Small Blue Diamond support diverse builders. Seek out startups, apps, and products created by women, people of color, queer technologists, and disabled creators. Representation doesn't just feel good. It shapes the systems we rely on. Ask questions. When a service uses AI, ask, how does it make decisions? Can I opt out? Who audits this tool? You're not being difficult. You're being responsible. Vote with your data. Privacy is power. Know what you're giving, to whom, and for what return. advocate for legislation that protects consumers and demands transparency from big tech, mentor or be mentored. Whether you're a student or a senior engineer, make space for learning in both directions. Growth doesn't happen in silos. And finally, don't buy the lie that you're too late, that all the big ideas are taken, that the future is already coded, sealed, and signed. Because every time someone like Asha dares to build differently, doors open for someone else, for a community, for a generation. In the lobby of Neuraloom's headquarters, carved into a sheet of recycled titanium alloy, hangs a single phrase: the future was never neutral, so we made it just. It isn't just a motto, it's a challenge. And now it's yours too. The age of passive technology is ending. The age of intentional innovation, of ethical systems, of shared futures, of human-first intelligence is just beginning. So lean in, ask better questions, build for the people who were never in the room. And remember, just like Asha did, you don't have to wait for the future to arrive. You have the power to shape it, right here, right now, together.